It is a recording in progress. Okay, awesome. At least something's in progress. Okay, got it. All right, so per the use. So our lecture, my goal is to get to the movie. I made popcorn. And when I make popcorn, I make it from the kernel. So I get the kernels, I put them in a bowl, a bunch of coconut oil, and I cook it over a flame. Okay, so none of that microwave bag stuff. Yeah, oh, that's awesome. So what I want to do is I just want to briefly talk about what we did last time, right? Because as we know, the long-term memory works best when you revisit. Okay, so we did a lot of work looking at three bonds. We looked at the different, still scrolling, the teachings and core values and the three bonds. And I think before that, we had already touched on the four dimensions, yeah. So last time, what we really focused on was the teaching and core values and then the three bonds, all right? But just to do a really good reminder, remember that there's four dimensions that Confucianism really likes to kind of pull all the threads through, okay, of human existence. And those are, just so we can refresh real quick, we should have a cheat sheet somewhere. First dimension is self as creative transformation. So not creative self-transformation, but the self as creative transformation, right? So always that idea of Confucianism is not that you are a self alone, turned in on yourself, but that you are a self because you are in relationship with others. And in being in relationship with others, you are always in the process or on a trajectory for encounter. And in that encounter, you will always be potentially changed. Okay, right? Think about it. One of the favorite things I used to do to teenagers are really fun to mess with, especially with like abstract concepts that are just beyond their abstract conceptual capability, right? But I would sit there and be like, you are not the same as you were a minute ago. Now you're different. Now you're different. Now you're different, right? Because and they were just like, oh my gosh. like I told them, because one of their fathers actually was the sort of the kind of like the principal of the school. And I would say to the daughter, I would say, you know, when your dad gets mad at you for doing something, you can legitimately claim, that wasn't me. I'm completely different now. I didn't do that. I said, but you can't tell him where you learned it. So Confucianism has this idea that the self is in creative transformation. Therefore, creative transformation defines the self. When you stop that creative transformation, there ceases to be the self. Okay, so when we think about death in the Confucian landscape, we see it as a cessation of the ability to transform, which means you can die living. Okay, but you can also die as well, transition into God, right? Death is just the stopping of time for someone. Okay, same thing for Confucius, it's the cessation of self as creative transformation, when it's no longer transforming, no longer creative. So death can take on multiple concepts in that regard. Okay, so then moving on from self as creative transformation, we looked at community as a necessary vehicle for human flourishing. Fancy language for just what we just talked about. Okay, so everything moves. Ooh, I did a really good job stacking all my stuff away. So everything is always yin yang, just kidding. Everything is always in consecutive circles, okay, nested circles. So the first dimension, second dimension, third dimension, fourth dimension, okay? And it's all one big thing, all right? Not a lot of binaries going on in Confucianism, all right? So here we have the self as creative transformation, then we have the community as the vehicle for human flourishing, because if I'm getting better, what happens to you three? You're gonna get better because I'm gonna try to improve my relationship with all three of you, right? Then that's gonna filter in. So the community becomes a vehicle for human flourishing, not only for the construction and the creativity of the transforming self, but also with that, my engagement with you then causes you to change, okay? And so there's this give and take. It's just got a really beautiful undulation to it, okay? And it's just left and right, forward and back, and then as you're moving, you're just making this whole entire thing what Confucius would call the way of heaven, right? You're just sort of making that space broader. All right, so community is the means. You can't do it, again, you can't do it alone. Though I do like to say, and this links us into the third dimension, right? Self as creative transformation, community as the vehicle for human flourishing, nature is your home, okay? Even if you do decide to pull a Lao Tzu and go up to the highest of mountaintops and be by yourself, well, I don't think Lao Tzu actually did that, but I do know that Taoists do want to, okay, really dedicated Taoists. Those are probably the most, out of all the traditions, those are probably the only militant interpretations that you'd want to encounter, because a militant Taoist would be adamant about that extraction of the person from society and its death-dealing ways and into nature, into the Tao, right? I can't think of another tradition I could actually say that about, but I feel like if I encountered a militant Taoist, it would be like finding a unicorn. The militant Buddhists with their weapons, yeah, I'm not talking about that. See, that kind of stuff does make me nervous, but a militant Taoist is someone who's going to be just, good luck finding them, actually. You know what I'm saying? Because they're in nature, seeking the Tao and eternal life in this moment. And so it's just not, they're not surrounded, yeah. So that's what I'm saying, like out of all the traditions when it comes to militancy, I feel like the least threatened by a militant Taoist, from what I understand about it. I could be wrong. There could be a whole like paradoxical army of Taoists. Okay. So third dimension is nature as home. That means when you do decide to go ascend up a mountain, you're not actually alone. There's bugs under the rocks that are going to encounter you and you're going to encounter them. And then there's always the mountain goat that's staring at you as you try to meditate. Okay, so you're always in relationship, whether it's the trees or the suns, and plus you need this environment. That whole thing in like Christian religious consciousness about like the material world being bad and the spirit world being good is so destructive. Okay, because because of that thought process, we have really downgraded the necessity and our dependence on this earth, and we have treated it like trash. Okay, and so with Confucianism and often with the Eastern traditions, I find that there is this appreciation for creation. Okay, we want to take care of, this is our home. And then heaven as the source of ultimate self-transformation. So as I said, all of those work together into this more cosmic spiritual state of this way of heaven being created around you as you're self-transforming. So I think how I referred to it was, if you're like stuck in a jelly mold, this is just key for survival. Someday you wake up, oh my gosh, I'm covered in Jello. You probably don't want to try to make your way all the way out of the Jello mold, right? What you're going to do is start carving out, right? Hold your breath, carve out as fast as you can, but you want to carve out a space, right? I always imagine that the self as creative transformation into the community, into nature, is this just sort of like kind of dance that just keeps widening this way of heaven, okay? And remember, it's always forward, backwards, left and right, diagonals, all these trajectories kind of shooting through, all right? And then as they do this way of heaven, and then as you're self-transforming, your way of heaven is, and then they merge, right? And then it starts to create a way of heaven behind us and a way of heaven before us. And so we start to make the way of heaven, all right? So that's the 4 dimensions. So just always remember that. When we get into teachings and core values, we have the analects, we have the importance of social relationships. This is what we talked about last time. We have relational orders, which is where the 3 bonds tend to kind of, I'm not a fan of the 3 bonds, sorry. But anyway, the 3 bonds tend to kind of latch on to the relationships and make them a little bit more of a hierarchy in certain regards. Now remember that in relationship order, we talked about the 5 relationships. Principally, those are ruler, subject, parent, child, husband, wife, elder brother, younger brother, and friend, friend. Okay? So those are the relationships that you find yourself in the most. Okay? And then there's some other aspects here. Education, specifically as it manifests in Ren, human-heartedness, and Li, that praxis, that outward manifestation of the human-heartedness, okay? So Ren and Li, the 4 dimensions, education, relationships, relational order, are all of these vital components of what's been going on so far, okay? All right, any questions about what those kind of core concepts? Okay. So remember that that the 3 bonds, just so you know, because we might touch on this just a little bit. The least appealing of Confucian ethics is the so-called 3 bonds, namely the authority of the ruler over the minister, the father over the son, and the husband over the wife. The 3 bonds were added to the 5 relationships later. Mencius, Confucius's 2nd gen disciple, creates the 5 relationships, all right? And he then, after he dies, a few centuries later, the 3 bonds get attached. And the 3 bonds sort of really create that strong societal structure that seems to almost just kind of obliterate the individual. Okay, it's really going to be sort of this like cohesive, for the community only, obey into the role that you've been born into type of situation. So not a lot of flexibility there. All right. So that is some of our review. Now, Confucian spirituality. Okay. If you've been listening closely, you might say, what? That can't be. Confucius didn't believe in a god or a spirit realm or whatever, so how can you have Confucian spirituality? Well, don't worry, class. I'm going to answer that question, okay? When it comes to elevating a spirituality component of Confucianism, the normal rules don't apply. See, you can call anything you want, because you can just switch the rules. Okay, but this is what I love about studying religions and traditions, is that each religion you encounter, you kind of have to leave your bag of analysis tools that you've picked up from your own tradition at the door and enter in to what feels like a potential haunted house. Scary. It's scary when you enter into another tradition, but then you leave it and you're like, oh, what a magical, wonderful garden, right? But like, you have to enter in vulnerable, so that you can be in a position of learning always. So Confucian spirituality, it's not an oxymoron. That's the word I was looking for before. It's not an oxymoron, it actually does apply, okay? If we can define spirituality in some way that relates to flourishing, then learning to be human, thus education, must be part of the dialogue about Confucian spirituality, okay? The process by which the self creatively transforms is kind of a spiritual practice, okay? It might not necessitate getting on one's knees and praying to something external, to someone external out and beyond the very material realm that we live in, but yet there is this idea of manifesting into something that has yet to appear in the material realm that you are stepping into. And part of that takes ritualistic discipline and focus and attention and listening and presence. And so many of those key words are actually very spiritual, right? Like listening to someone, being present, wanting to, allowing love in your heart to inform your activity towards someone, being better towards the creation. I think that in some way we really can call a lot of that spirituality. Spirituality for the Confucian is an existential commitment to self realization with the community, local and cosmic. I like thinking about the cosmic community. Through education. All right, this is where we're going to get not only dynamic versus static, but the paradox of everyone's a sage in the process of becoming a sage. Okay, right? Sages, but never becomes a sage. Does that make sense? Okay, if you ever get to a point where you're like, I am a sage, that for Confucius would be the #1 indicator that you in fact are not. Okay, because a sage would never say that, because the sage would be very aware that there is still tons of earth to traverse before one actually stops being able to traverse the earth. Right? So the paradox exists. Every person is a sage and in the process of becoming a sage. This is the Confucian way. This is spirituality for Confucianism. This is where we get into that dynamic. It's always moving. It's always fluid. It's always going from one thing to another. That static moment where you feel that you have achieved something is a walking death. Not if, let's say, you're working on a discipline and you get really good at that discipline, that's fine, but you don't want to ever stop there, because that would take that whole self as creative transformation process and would render it as not the ideal consistent state, but would render it as a means to an end for your own benefit and purpose. And that's just not the Confucian way. Does that make sense? So this is why the sage is always in the process of being a sage. True sage is never a sage. That might sound a little coarse against ears that like to acquire degrees. Right? Some people do. Some people do. Yes. Yeah. There are things that, like someone says, I love that example of humility. I was reading about it in Luther today, that this humbleness is like something you never get to. Because as soon as you get to it, you're like, oh, I'm so humble. Oh, no, I'm not, But that awkward situation when someone compliments you, like, oh, you're so humble, and you're like, oh, thanks. It's that thing that constantly reveals itself as just outside of your grasp. And I think that therein, that pursuit is that humility, right? It does render us weak in the knees, because we won't ever actually be able to claim it, because as soon as we do, it ceases to happen. Such an excellent, excellent example. Human activity is paramount. All right, the human being makes the way great, and not vice versa, as in the culture of the society does not improve or manifest transformation on its own. Okay, what can I think of here? It is great to read books. I am a fan of reading books, okay? I spend most of my time reading books. I'm also a fan of always wanting to read books that challenge the status quo that I've been raised in, right? So whether it's skin color or sexuality or gender and identity and all that stuff, right? Reading has this interesting thing when you partake in it, because you read it and you feel so enlightened and you're like, yeah, I know some stuff, right? But the problem is that you just acquiring some information, and I say this as a very humble Enneagram 5, with a tendency to read and sit on her knowledge. But if you just read and you don't follow up with action, What's the point? Okay, so for Confucians in their spirituality, culture won't move unless we're moving it, okay? Unless we're driving it. So we can sit and we can read all the books on race and white supremacy, and we can read all the books on sexual orientation and identity and gender, and know the language inside and out. But if we're not actually in the world using that knowledge to inform our action, then society won't change. If we keep all that information to ourselves, society won't change. So it's great to have book studies, but that book study has to motivate its participants into the world to do something. Because we can get very confident on the acquisition of knowledge. Okay, it feels really good when you read a hard book that confronts some of your biases, right? You're like, I'm a different person now. Confucius would say, proof is in the pudding. Glad you read the book. Now let's see what's happening with you in the world, okay? Are you advocating for oppressed groups? Are you, so there is a need for that. In the Protestant realm of sort of the Western world, that emphasis on justification by faith alone is so beautiful. Done right, it's stunning. But it simultaneously has ended up with, I'm justified with Jesus. See you guys later. I'm good. You guys okay? Why don't you learn Jesus, right? This is what happens. The Protestant Christian can find themselves very detached and removed because, well, their soul is taken care of. And, when Jesus comes back, this whole entire world will be, revamped anyway. So let it burn, right? And that's just that doesn't really create any sort of IRL heaven for anyone else. You and your conscience are fine, but meanwhile, the world is literally burning. And people are living in dire circumstances. So what does it mean to have faith, right? Questions that Confucius asks us, all right? Spirituality also manifests in commitment to reasonableness of this world, the here and now, and to the possibility and actuality of transformation. All right, so part of Confucian spirituality is going into the world rather than taking flight from the world. Okay, this is really where if you come back around next fall, I'll do Taoism. And if we kept notes, really good notes, you'd be able to see just what great distinction there is between Taoism and Confucianism, and how they themselves almost kind of spin into like a yin-yang unity. But it's not about taking flight. That's not what Confucius is about. It's all about being grounded in this material world. Remember, the nature is your home. So take care of your home. Okay, a Confucian realizing her spirituality engages in the structures and sociality of the world. So not just coming here or coming to your local community gathering, but like actually getting involved with maybe the political structures, the cultural structures, actually wanting to participate in moving the society forward. We're getting it, making sure that staticness doesn't, that septic staticness doesn't sort of hunker it down and anchor it in, okay? The Confucian will wrestle with the mundane and monotonous of the culture and society, okay? The mundane and the monotonous, what's not working. Okay, remember, self as creative transformation. Death is when that self stops transforming. A society is also a type of self. When that society's wheels just get real deep in those ruts and just can't move, a Confucian would look around and say, we need to tackle some of these things because our society has gotten stuck, okay? So there's always movement forward. Never a slogan about anything happening again, okay? Like there's a limitation, it's all about, let's make Confucianism great by unearthing its wheels that's gotten stuck and the grass has grown over them. Never like a rolling it back, okay? It's always about going forward, so always moving. and vowing to do that which cannot be done. This sort of elevates the Confucian imagination, in my opinion, this idea of Confucius believing that you vow to do the thing that cannot be done. While Confucius is very grounded in the material realm, the here and now, what you see is what you get, there's also this eye towards possibility. Possibility, in my opinion, for Confucius, exists not in someone, but outside of someone. Okay, you step into this possibility, and then you just keep stepping into the possibility. You bring the actuality, actually produces the possibility of something else. So as the Confucian wrestles with the monotonous and the mundane of society and moves that whole wagon forward, now there's another space into which that wagon can then move forward again. There's always a possibility just outside of the actuality of what is going on. Okay? Does that make sense? What do you mean? Yeah, yeah. Grand Valley Interfaith Network Day. Yeah, I got us re-registered in there. But yeah, like that talking, yeah, there's a problem. Someone comes up with a solution, that solution then multiplies, and now we can potentially have the houseless housed during the coldest weeks of the year, right? So, but that all starts with a willingness to move something into a realm that maybe hasn't been done for a while. It ceased to exist, so you're going to roll it forward and it's going to start to exist again here. So you're moving that thing. Possibility, when we anchor possibility within ourselves, then we say things mostly in like hindsight. Oh, I never achieved my full possibility. I could have done anything, but I made all these bad mistakes and now I'm this person, right? We will say, oh, they had so much potential. I can't believe they made that choice, right? It's sort of the word of condemnation. When we anchor possibility as something that we have to sort of jimmy up from the inside, rather than seeing it as something that exists outside of us, that we are called and lured into, maybe by friends, right? Maybe by family, maybe by activism, right? Where we are called into this realm of possibility. All right, so I like to always keep possibility outside of myself, mostly because it's a total chaotic mess in here and we don't need to sully possibility with all that chaotic mess. But really, possibility exists outside of us. And I think that's the safest place for it, because once you step here, it kind of slides out because now this becomes the actual. And so you're always creating this way of heaven, okay? That's my big way of saying to Aristotle. But possibility, you never know. That's what I love about that in this, and this is what I love about Confucianism, but there's always this thing where you never know what someone's going to bring to the space. Even if 100 times before they've brought like some bad stuff, there could be that 101st time where they don't. And so there's always this possibility that exists. I think that for Christians, it would be the realm of forgiveness. That's what that actual moment of that pronouncement, I forgive you, is sort of this actual thing that goes into time and space and makes this creative moment of possibility for someone to step into and maybe not hurt you again, right? I'm always cautious with that because Christianity has done a number on forcing people to forgive when really they needed to walk away and forgive from a distance. But anyway, forgiveness is an actual event that creates something. Possibility. Okay, so apart from vowing to do that which cannot be done, which is that thing which has not been seen yet, but which may exist somewhere in possibility, and making it actual. Spirituality is individual and communal. It really takes me and you and the whole entire group here to move this whole entire wagon forward. Okay, so part of Confucian spirituality is going into the world rather than taking flight from it. Oh wait, sorry, I'm repeating myself. We must, according to Confucius, take our lives in the present very seriously. We self-realize ourselves for our own sakes, not selfishism though, because we are transformable beings in community. This doesn't mean that there isn't individuality, but rather to emphasize the importance of community for that individuality. Okay, you don't exist as an individual by your own, apart and separate, apart from community, right? So remember, you have yourself as creative transformation, and then outside of that, you have the community as a vehicle for human flourishing, all right? This all works together. Your spirituality and your relationship with your community are actually one and the same, okay? They work together. Others assist you in your creative self-transformation, and you assist others in their creative self-transformation. Self as creative transformation. All right, you really can't practice Li if you don't have a community. Okay, and what good is your human-heartedness if you're just going to keep it to yourself? Is that human-heartedness? Right? Like, that's the question we need to ask. The world is redeemable through self-cultivation. Thus, to cultivate the self is part of the process to redeem the world. What is that saying about, like, if you want to change the world, start with yourself? Is that Gandhi? All right, great. Well, there's some confusion in that. And if I'm understanding chronology correctly, Confucius said it first. Confucius did say that. It's really true though. Have you ever had success trying to change the world by changing other people, but just neglecting to change yourself? Anyone here ever try to raise kids and get them to do? What's the best way to get kids to do things that you want them to do? Do it yourself. Model it. Incorporate yourself into, she's like, wait, you should take your own medicine, mommy. But you want them to read more, you read more. You want them to write letters, you write letters, right? Because they pick up on what they're seeing, okay? You want them off their phones, you get off your phones. There's just a way to do it where you are necessarily in the process of also creatively self-transforming, as you ask your kids to as well, or ask your church community to as well, or whatever. So for me, as a leader in this community, it is absolutely important that whatever I'm expecting the congregation to participate in, I'm willing to participate in. This means I don't sign us up for anything. No, just kidding. I just keep that bar super low. No, but there's that, I always like, can I take this on as well? Because I'm not gonna sit in my, it's not really a plush chair, it's a buoy chair, but it kind of weebles and wobbles. I'm not gonna sit behind my desk and like get mad at the congregation for not participating in something if I myself am not going to be here with my sleeves rolled up and getting, you know, elbow deep dirty and rummaging through the church and cleaning it up, right? Leaders lead by example. This is part of the reason why in Confucianism, that ruler-subject relationship is really interesting, because the ruler is only a ruler and has the authority of a ruler if the people give it, and the ruler has to earn it by participating in the communal life, okay? And cultivation is not just internal, but physical. Education incorporates discipline of the body. The notion of shen qiao, often translated as exemplary teaching, literally means body teaching, teaching through the example of the body. Okay, literally what I was just talking about. You want people to be more involved? get more involved, right? It starts with that. It seems, I don't know, maybe oxymoronic, but it actually really makes sense. You know, if you get involved, then you can get more people involved. Anyway, that's sort of the spirituality component. I kind of want to probably not do too much more. And that's a really good breaking point. One, to field any questions or comments or added things, potty break, and then come back and watch Dead Poets Society. Anything to add to the discussion? Yeah. Oh, calling, yes. Yeah. 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 And by calling, you mean like just sort of our place and presence in the world. Yeah. 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 There's always you always have to hold all three strands of time in your hands. You have been for me as a Protestant, I have been justified, I am being justified, and I will be justified. Okay? There's never just one of those. It's always all three at once. The past, the present, and the future all collide in God to be, wand of time. Okay, this is my favorite. All right. So like we always think of time like this. And so it's hard for us to understand I am justified, I am being justified, I will be justified, right? Like we can understand those words, but this is what it is in God, right? This whole entire thing is but one sphere, one dot, one point in God. For us, it's a bunch of points. And sometimes it feels backwards and forwards. But in God, all time is one moment in the past and the future. It's all of three of them are all wound up. If you really want to mess with teenagers, tell them they're already dead and in heaven. Because then they're like, that's not funny. Wait, how? But that whole idea of you haven't been born, you are dying, and you're already dead. That's what that chronology in God essentially is, because God is all the way around that, right? So whatever that conception is, God is all the way around it. In time, our chronology exists in that. We're already with those who have transcended into God before us. But right now, we're not. And like a bunch of years ago, we definitely weren't. And we were, 100%. But yeah, that whole idea. So what's interesting to me, bringing up that whole thing, like God gave you a gift that you manifest into the world, right? And that idea of calling, is there a downside to that? Like, what's the potential downside to calling? Because that's a little bit more of an abstract concept. Right. Yeah. Mm. Mhm. Hmm. Right. Yep. That's okay. Yeah. 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 Ish. Ish. But that is that is yes, definitely in relationship to this building. But that is important, right? Because if we get into, because we can, as you said, that was so beautifully said. Okay, we can have a linear approach to calling that becomes static and kind of septic in that we then I'm seeing it right now in my watching my father, he just turned 80, dynamic guy, and very, very capable, but his identity was definitely infused in his position on Wall Street, and that position's been gone. But you can see this, I don't know who I am, because we do, I think we, full stop, I achieved this thing, I am now a doctor, I am now a priest, I am now this. But meanwhile, there is a need for that creative, that self as creative transformation to manifest that further, because God never stops calling us, right? We say things like, God's mercies are new every morning, but then somehow we get the idea that our calling is just once, and it's just one thing. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and it's so hard. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's such a good point, because there is a need to sort of be a little bit loose gripped on those things. One thing that I was thinking of is what happens um, when you don't really have a calling. You feel judged. What if you just do what you do because you know what, you're kind of really good at it, but it's not like, not everyone feels like they have a calling and then pursues it. So have they missed God? But that's why some of that language, that's what I'm always careful with that language of, God is giving you a special gift, because I do think that just existing is like really part of the gift, maybe all of it. What if you don't have passion though? Hmm. But what if you don't have it? What if it never shows up? Have you missed out on something that God was handing out? I think for some of us who are more intense, that's a really foreign concept. Okay. I have known I wanted to be a teacher from the very, 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 very beginning. Like, I think as soon as I learned how to write words, I was like, and yes, I will be a teacher. Never wanted to be a priest. I need to be honest. That wasn't the thing I wanted to be, and I wrestle with that every day. I think that's part of my saging. um, but I know many, many, many super talented people that are very good at a variety of things, but that idea that every human being has a path, that's actually a very privileged message, and something that kind of exists in a way that a lot of other people don't have access to it. But that's just, and that's why when you said it, I immediately thought of the conversations I've had with a number of other people who are just like, I don't know, I just do this, pays the bills, I get through. We don't really live in a system that allows us to even begin to cultivate creative passions, because we have to get the bills paid. The pills bade, some say. But you know what I'm saying? Yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting message. Mhm. Mhm. Yes, yes, yes. And that's where that's a link back to what you were saying with Martin Luther is that if you're milking a cow, that is as and more divine than going into a monastery and becoming a monk and saying vows. Literally, Martin Luther spent a lot of time elevating the material world as something beautiful and to be enjoyed. And being a dad and a son, and I'm speaking from Martin Luther's perspective, and a teacher and someone who meddled in a bunch of politics, um, was fine. You don't need, that's why he ditched when all those sacraments, the examination of all the sacraments, and he ditched ordination like real fast. He had three for a long time. That absolution, penance was a big one. That took a long time to drop off. But anyway, yes, absolutely. That idea that just existing in the world and knowing who you are and knowing who God is the passion, is the gift. Now just go live, right? You don't have to add another work onto it as if you have to conjure something up. So some of us are super intense. I'm not one of those people, so I don't know what that's like at all. But some of us are not. And together we make the world go forward. Because you can't have, could you imagine the whole entire world just like filled with just intense people? It's called New York, yes. I would say also the South, they're pretty intense as well. It's done completely differently, but I went to school in North Carolina. It's way more subtle, but it's intense. Especially the criticisms, those are good. Bless her heart. Oh, bless your heart, you're from the North. I'm like, wait a second, that sounded nice. Okay, anything else to add? That's a really, really important conversation, so I'm really glad you guys brought it up, so thank you. Yeah, 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 yeah. Community is absolutely crucial for Luther and Luther's understanding of the way that justification by faith works out towards the neighbor. Um, so anyway, all right, let's take a little break, and then when you come back, I have bowls, I have popcorn, I have napkins, and we'll get a. Yeah, I was like, we're watching a movie. In my house, we eat popcorn. Hello. Yes, you want some? This is a fact.